All right. Hey, everyone. This is the follow-up to the vector data lecture. So today I will be talking about the counterpart there, raster data, and then getting into some of the tools, namely xarray, that we'll use to work with raster data and sort of more generally geospatial data that is multidimensional. So just a reminder, GIS sort of software has two sorts of frames of view on data types. So there's the left, there's this raster data, which we'll be talking about today, and that has sort of like pixels in an image. And then there's the vector data, which is sort of more geometric in nature and is what we were operating on with GeoPandas. So being able to make maps and pull out points in different counties or watersheds and things like that. So just to get to it, raster data here are basically arrays under the hood where data in each cell is, is approximately some sort of defined shape or size in a particular coordinate representation system. And so again, this means that the data actually is referencing a place on the Earth or some other planetary body, for instance. And so you most undoubtedly have seen examples of raster data, even though you may not have been calling it that. And so some examples include like aerial and satellite data. So like when you go on Google Maps or whatever, that is sort of a very fine scaled raster data that the rest of the stuff is overlaid onto. And then there are things like elevation maps, like we have on the right, and like soil classification maps, for instance. So the data in each of these pixels or cells can be multiple data types. So it can be a continuous value. That would be something like elevation, where that value can vary smoothly and continuously. Then there are discrete values, which would be something like maybe a count, like the number of population in a particular county. That's discrete because you can't have like half a person. And then finally, there's categorical data, which would be something like the soil type, whether you have like a sandy environment or more like a clay environment. And so there's sort of a fixed number of them that can be assigned to any given pixel. And similarly, you could have something like ordinal data. So categorical kind of falls into two camps. There's just discrete data, which just has different values, but there's no particular ordering. And then there's also nominal data, which would be something like a grade. So if you looked at like the average grade of high school math class, for instance, in each county, that has a ranking, but it's still discrete, like A, B, C, etc. So those are kind of the types. They can be in these cells for the raster data. But the thing to kind of know is that in a raster, all of the pixels need to be of the same type. So you can't really mix and match there. And so there are many ways that raster data comes. There's a bunch of data formats, for instance, just a few of them here. There's TIFF, GRIBS, BIL, and then NetCDF, which we'll be mostly talking about for the remainder of this class. And then finally, XAR is a new one that, again, as I mentioned, was sort of a new development, and it's kind of built off of a lot of the ideas of the NetCDF model, but make it a lot more friendly for use in cloud computing and things like that. And so these raster data formats kind of always, at least in the context of GIS, contain a certain amount of metadata, which would be things like the extent, so like kind of the bounding box of where the data comes from, its resolution. So you can see in the top right here, we have the same image, but of varying resolution. So when you do create a map onto some sort of an overlay, it knows exactly how big to draw each pixel. Then things like the coordinate representation system, so that you know where to locate it in space, and things like that. So along with all of the array data, you have all of that metadata, which helps you locate where you are in space. And then finally, there's this term that a lot of GIS and other related softwares use called bands. And this is, you can think of this in the same way as having separate variables in your raster data. And so just one example of this would be that, like a satellite image, when you go on Google Maps, you see sort of like you would see like a photo, and that's broken up into 3 different bands, which are the blue, red, green, and blue sort of filters that, when combined, give us what we would call the true color image. And so in a satellite data set, you might have bands that break up into various wavelengths of light, like red, green, and blue, but bands could also be things like different variables. So if you have one that's wind speed, you might have another that could be something like precipitable water. And so these are referred to as bands in some literature, and variables in others. So, but you can think of them sort of interchangeably for the most part. Okay, so sort of from a practical standpoint, working with raster data in Python, there are several routes that you can go. So there is, as I mentioned in the vector data, there's the bindings to GDAL, which is sort of this big underlying set of software that has been around for some time, and it kind of sets the standard for GIS type data processing, and that is through that OSGeo package. But there's a more modern and sort of Pythonic interface to GDAL like tools with something called raster.io, also pronounced rasterio, depending on your background. And then there's what we're going to be talking about, xarray, which has sort of its own data model that is not specific to GIS software, but can be used in that context because it's more general. And then on top of that, there is actually a combination of rasterio and xarray that really interoperates them together and kind of brings the best of both worlds. We won't be using that in this particular class, but I wanted to throw it out there because it is very useful when you run into situations where it's necessary, and that is called Rio xarray. So again, we're going to be focusing on xarray here, and you can kind of see their little logo looks like what I talked about in class the other day, which I'm going to return to here, just to kind of move away from sort of strictly raster data where we're really focused on GIS sorts of viewpoints. This sort of netCDF framing, which xarray adopts, is a little bit more general, but really still fits into this idea of geospatial data. And so what I'd like to kind of go through here again is sort of breaking down the pieces of how this is set up in xarray and netCDF kind of more specifically, because netCDF was the inspiration, you could say, for developing xarray as a Python package. So in this sort of context, there are all of these different types of things that are basically there to help you keep track of what your data is, where it applies to, and gives you tools to operate on it in really efficient ways, so that you don't have to do a lot of code writing yourself. You can just use pre-built functions. So this all starts kind of from the idea of you have data variables, which kind of are the underlying arrays that you would want to operate on. And they, are some big multi-dimensional arrays. They can have, they represent something. So in this case, there's one for temperature and one for pressure. And those represent something. And if you just have this in NumPy world where they are just their bare arrays, you kind of have to keep track of, where do these apply? Do they have a particular time resolution? That's all stuff that you would need to kind of keep track of and always know which index or which dimension is each of those different things. So the thing that xarray adds on top of this idea is the idea of dimensions and coordinates. And you can think of dimensions and coordinates sort of like we saw with pandas as an index, which is basically sort of a way to sort of align all of your other data. So the coordinates and dimensions are how you align multiple variables like temperature and pressure here. And those coordinates basically are descriptions of where you are. And the same with dimensions. So just to get into each of these specifically, dimensions are kind of like this inner box here, which is also labeled as indices or indexes. These are basically names. They're just names for each of the dimensions of your data. So in this case, it's saying this sort of y-axis here, or this vertical axis here in all of these arrays is latitude. So if you go, say, in this pressure box, if you start here on this sort of grid cell and you go up one, you're increasing in latitude. And that would be some real valued latitude change, not just necessarily a +1. That's sort of the nice thing about having these as labeled coordinates. And similarly for time, for instance, if this is a daily data set, this is day 1, day 2, day 3. And you now always have it kept track of where in the time dimension you are with an actual sort of timestamp. So instead of just being time 7, it can be time is July 4th. And so these are ways that you can sort of more easily keep track of what sort of operations you want to do and how you can align data more effectively with less code. And then finally, there's a piece here called the attributes. So this is basically just for things like if you want to keep track of the units of the data, or if you want to say, hey, I modified this data with this algorithm on this day, that's also something that you could add. So it adds two things. One is just like it makes it easier to understand your data or understand other people's data more likely. And then it also gives you sort of a way to provide provenance. So you can always kind of come back to attributes and metadata to see how that data was produced. If the data set has a strong sort of enforcement of these attributes. And so this is something that is more or less up to you to keep track of. It's not enforced anywhere, and you can really add whatever you'd like there. Okay, so you might be wondering, like, why do we need another package for multi-dimensional arrays? We have NumPy, and like, why do we even need these labeled dimensions and coordinates? So I'd like to just walk through a few of these operations that you can do that make xarray much nicer. So the first one is you can apply operations over dimensions by name rather than index. So if I have some variable x and I do something with xarray with it, I just do x.sum and say which dimension as a name. Again, this is because dimensions have names rather than indices. And so I just say, I want to sum over the time. However, if I was in NumPy world, I'd have to call np.sum of x, and then I have to know which of the axes or which of the dimensions is time in the NumPy array. So here I would say dim equals 2 if I kept track in my head where the first dimension is latitude, second is longitude, and finally the third is time. So, I kind of have to do this mental mapping on my own instead of just saying it outright. And you're much more likely to make a typo of 1 versus 2 rather than time versus lat. So that's one way that this actually makes your life easier. But really the next one is where I think this really shines through is if I want to select a value by its label rather than by an integer index. And by label, I mean like the thing that I'm actually after. So this example is choosing January 1st of 2014. In xarray, I just do x.sel for select, time equals that that date. I just type in the date as you would read it out like a regular person. However, in NumPy, I need two things. I need my X, which is just the multi-dimensional array. And then I need a second array, which is this time ARR, time array, and that would have date stamps in it. And then, so kind of what you need to do, and this is where, we have to work from inside to out. Okay, so first thing I need to do is find where time array is equal to 2014-0101. Okay, so I can do that. That's one operation. Then I have to select out the exact index where that's true. And that is doing this np.where and then drop equals true. So this just gives me a single integer value. And then now I can put that into my indexing. And you'll note that this actually only works if these are one-dimensional. If X is the same as it was up here, this wouldn't work again, and you would need to know to put colon here so that I get to the third dimension. So, this is it. I don't even have to remember where in the dimensions time is in Xarray. Everything just happens automatically. And then finally, just like pandas, you can do things like group by. And so if I wanted to take the annual average of some variable X, I would just do X group by time.year and then take the mean of it. In NumPy, there is no single line solution. You have to write loops and you have to know kind of how to chunk it out. You would need to know, for instance, if you have to deal with leap years or not. So this becomes messy really quickly, and Xarray just gives you a way to just do it in one line. Don't think about it. Someone else has already done this for you. And so kind of the end takeaway here is that I would offer up is you can think of Xarray as an extension of pandas into n-dimensional arrays, just as a mental model for how a lot of things in Xarray work. However, there are definitely a lot of add-ons and things that Xarray has that pandas doesn't, and vice versa, just because their two data models are slightly different. Okay, so with that, I just want to really throw out this brief aside here, because this is kind of where we're starting to get into this whole world of we now have worked with a bunch of different packages, and I wanted to throw out this figure that came up in an Pangeo tutorial. And so Pangeo is sort of a broad coalition of folks on this project to basically sort of make it really easy for all of these different software packages to interoperate. So in here, you'll see there's a bunch that we've already been working with. We have sort of Python at its core. We have NumPy, and as you go out, these are sort of more specialized things. So you'll see that NumPy is in here. We have Jupyter, Pandas, Matplotlib, and then Xarray's in there as well. So this is kind of like, you can kind of think about the scientific Python world as kind of slowly growing into all these different packages, but they're all kind of coming from the same place and trying to interoperate really well. And so that's one thing that Xarray does really nicely in this space. Okay, so from here, I want to offer up this interactive Xarray tutorial. This will, if you click it, take you into the Jupyter Lab environment that we were in class the other day. It seems like mine has timed out already here. So I'll go ahead and try this again. And so this will spin you up into that environment, and you can see the really nice tutorial that the Xarray folks have put together. And I'm not going to be recording a specific video lecture on this. I just wanted to open this up so that you could see how to get there and what it should look like. And basically, this is taken from the SciPy 2022 workshop that I believe was somewhere 2.5 hours long or so. Maybe even longer, yeah. So we see started at 1:30, ends at 5:30. So this was sort of a half-day event then. So you can feel free to work through these, but again, all you have to do is sort of click on each one. So for instance, if I wanted to go to computation, you can jump to it. It will bring you to your new notebook and kind of walk you through how to do things. And this works just like VS Code, where each cell is sort of defined by some chunk of thing, and then you can use Shift Enter on it to run it and, for instance, look at some data sets that they provide for you. So this is entirely up to you to look at your convenience, and we will be working with some of our own tutorial data, and I'll be walking you through some sort of starter code here in class, and then you will see your assignment alongside that. Okay, thanks.